There's an idea that many young adults are simply disengaged with the political process, but the data shows a different story. While there are many barriers that keep young adults from voting, more young people are participating in elections. In 2024, 47% of young people voted in the presidential election. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today is Election Day. We're going to spend the hour talking about the youth vote, and we'll also talk about how social media and AI are changing the nature of political ads. And if you voted in this year's election, we would love to hear from you, especially if you're Gen Z. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You can also email us at wherewelive@ctpublic.org. Joining us now is Rudy Garrett. She's the Vice President of Capacity Building at the Alliance for Youth Organization, which is a national organization that supports youth-led movements. Thank you so much, Rudy, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also with us is Alberto Medina. He's the Communications Manager at the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University. Appreciate you being here with us as well, Alberto.
Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
And Michael Franz. He's the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project and professor of government at Bowdoin College. Thank you, Michael, for being with us.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
So jump straight to it. Rudy, I'm going to start with you here. We'd love to know, what do we know about how young adults are engaging with the political process, from voting to protesting to even running for office?
We definitely notice that young people are starting to vote at higher margins. In some cases, they're outvoting their own parents' generation, which is really exciting to see as millennials start to become the major part of the electorate. We're noticing that young people are taking the streets and participating in direct actions and just overall engaging in more civic participation, may that be through local community organizations or having more civic conversations or political conversations with friends and family. We definitely see in this current political environment that young folks are taking a diverse set of actions to be more involved.
When did you start seeing that shift, or was there a shift? And is that something, was the momentum sort of building up until this moment, or did you see that change recently?
I believe that we've actually been seeing that shift over the last decade of young people becoming more engaged. I think the cornerstone being the Obama election, where young people were really captured by a candidate that what seemed like was motivated by youth values and centered young people's experiences. And we've also just seen a larger investment in hyperlocal politics as well. Folks being involved in their communities and also understanding what's going on and how to make the changes they want to see in their neighborhoods, which is very empowering. And that increase in participation has steadily grown over the past, I'd say, decade.
And Alberto, we started off with this idea that young adults are typically pretty disengaged in the political process. Is there any truth to that?
There's some truth, but not quite as much as I think most people would think or would believe. We always say that the issue with youth voting, the reason why young people as a whole generally vote at lower rates than older adults, it's more about access and about some of those barriers that you alluded to than about apathy. So yes, there is still some percentage of youth who, if you ask them, they'll say, well, I don't really care about this, or I don't sort of understand how this connects to my life or to the things that I care about. Which, as we think about it, Circle is less an issue of apathy itself too. It's more of a failure of our communities and our institutions, our education system to help young people make those connections, to help them understand why they should care, why it's so important. But even the young people who do say that are a minority of young people. Voting is new for youth. They need to learn about it. They need to register. Young people are moving around. There's all kinds of structural, and logistical issues and barriers that young people face that mean that, youth voting isn't just lower than older adults for this generation. It's been lower for every generation because every generation, turns 18 and has to register and has to deal with a lot of these same issues. So, as Rudy was saying, we do find in Circle data, young people more motivated. We've been in kind of a high youth turnout era. And I think a lot of that is due to young people really seeing a need for their engagement, really seeing that they have power, that they can wield it. So, we still have a bit of a ways to go in making sure that all young people feel that way, but it is a growing trend.
And Michael, curious to hear what you're seeing too, especially given what we've heard from Rudy and Alberto so far. Are you seeing more young people wanting to be engaged, or they've always been engaged, but perhaps the spotlight was never on them?
Yeah, I think these are great comments, and I think it's true that the excitement and the engagement of younger people in many cases today is spiking for certain issues, especially in very recent years. I was thinking as both Rudy and Alberto were talking about a longer time period, which is there's an older book now that was written about 25 years ago called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam that documents a sort of long decline of civic life in the United States and the ways in which people started disengaging from their communities, back into the 70s, 80s as television and other media technologies sort of entered our lives. And this book was written prior to the development of these new technologies like smartphones and so forth. And it was a sort of a call to action to some extent about what this meant for our communities if we were less engaged. And I think it led to a lot of counter movements, a lot of people asking really tough questions about how do we get people back involved?
Mm-hmm.
How do we get people re-engaged in civic life? And as these technologies develop, they obviously have some potential impact in furthering that disengagement. I mean, we can get lost in our phones very easily, but they also do allow us to connect and to hear from political movements and candidates in new ways that can make participation also easier, connect us to people in new ways, and can educate us and inform us in new ways. And so, as we're adapting and living into those new technologies, I think we're seeing some of those effects in somewhat of a positive way too, especially as it connects people to candidates and social movements that seem to energize young people.
Right. And then we're going to expound more on sort of the present and the future in terms of what role technology plays, including social media and our phones, and how we get information today versus in the past. But I do want to sort of rewind a little bit because you mentioned, historically, there's always been some movement. There's like ebbs and flows, like most things. And curious to hear, Michael, have we seen other times in history that young people have been more engaged in the political process, especially using the Vietnam War era as an example, where we saw many young people participated with protests and other forms of activism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. I think thinking about the social movements of the 1960s and the way in which the baby boomer generation sort of emerged into the political scene, challenged the status quo in lots of ways around civil rights, around the war, around women's rights movement, and so forth, really was a sea change in engagement from younger people. Thinking back prior to that, when many young people were, deeply committed to institutions and the status quo, and people started questioning those things and looking for change. And I think it inspired a lot of change that we're seeing, have seen in the last number of generations. And we're still grappling with those things. We're still grappling with racial equality, with tensions over gender issues, with tensions around what should be the proper role of the United States in foreign policy, and so on. And it was really all instigated and started in really dramatic ways through those movements in the 1960s.
Well, and making a connection there, because we've talked about young people wanting to get involved because of certain social issues or social movements. What about when it comes to a politician? Because it sounds like there are different ways that influence political engagement, and sometimes it's an issue, sometimes it's a person. So how have we seen this play out in recent elections when it comes to the politician?
I would say that from what we've seen in our data, young voters have been highly, highly issue motivated. When we ask young people, why do you vote? Why do you want to vote? Far and away, the most common answer is for action on issues that I care about. And those issues are pretty diverse. I mean, in recent cycles, especially in 2024, it has been a little bit of it's the economy stupid. Inflation, jobs have far and away been the top issue for young people, yeah, as well as for older adults. But certainly, issues like climate change, issues like gun violence, issues like racial justice have been at the top of young people's priority list as well. And kind of as Mike was saying about previous generations, we've seen that in recent years, not just manifested as, oh, that's why I go to the polls, but that's why I participate in social movements. That's why I go protest. So if we think about the gun violence prevention movement in 2018 after the Parkland shooting, if we think about the racial justice movement after the George Floyd murder in 2020, these were really youth-led movements, in which especially diverse young people were playing a huge role. And I think that influences politics, right? I think that helps create a world in which if you were a politician, you had to have a position on guns. You had to have a position on racial justice because you understood that that's what young people were looking to you for. That's what was going to help you hopefully earn young people's votes. And so I think that's another huge way that young people influence our civic life and our political process. They will tell us, if we listen, and sometimes the listening is a bit of a challenge because we still have a bit of a problem of not taking young people as seriously as we could and should in politics. But if we listen, they will tell us loud and clear what they want to see from our politics, from the candidates that are vying for their support. And that can have a huge impact on elections.
Well, I think you touched on something really powerful here, where oftentimes it's not because the young people, it's not because they don't want to participate, but it's because they are in a space where perhaps they don't feel comfortable or they're not being heard. But we are seeing a lot of movement out there from politicians that have been really good at mobilizing the youth vote. Rudy, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, especially working with a lot of young folks. Can you talk about how we've seen this play out? And just to use a millennial example, as we were talking about our own experiences earlier, I have very clear memories of the movement that was trying to get young people like myself at the time to go out to vote was MTV doing a movement called Vote or Die. I don't know if you all remember that, but I'm not sure if that actually did much, because I remember reading it afterwards that it was more of a show. It was very performative versus actually getting young people out to vote. So just using that as an example from the past, I'm so curious to hear, what are you seeing today from where you're sitting, Rudy?
I think what is particularly advantageous for the youth movement, like I mentioned earlier, is that young people are becoming a requirement for people to win elections, not a nice to have. So you have at this point, if you want to win an election, you have to have young people, you have to have millennials and Gen Z as a part of your strategy to be able to win elections. So you have to be catering to and listening to their issues. And that creates a huge opportunity. So as Alberto was saying, like young people, they have opinions. We have very strong desires to make sure that our issues are being seen in not just like federal policy, but in local policy as well. And so young people are able to take the streets, and politicians don't have to listen to those actions. And sometimes those actions are for or against them. So like they have to be paying attention to those things now. And I think that is really beautiful because it's like democracy in action. You're actually having to listen to the people that you represent in real life. And I'm seeing it play out in a lot of really unique ways. Yes, obviously direct action is a really beautiful form of protest and uplifting voices together as a community. But we're also seeing young people coming together online, which I'm sure we'll have Mike talk a little bit more about later. But it's a beautiful thing that people are finding their communities everywhere. They're finding them with local community organizations, where they're providing direct services, may it be for mutual aid, especially as Alberto mentioned earlier, in this economy, folks have a lot of direct need. And so providing resources and community is a way that young people are finding really helpful and meaningful to make sure that everybody around them has what they need to survive. We're seeing young people participating in voter registration drives and know your rights information, especially in this current environment where ICE is in our neighborhoods and directly impacting the people that we care about. So wanting to be a resource for others to be able to like understand what our rights are and how to protect the people we care about. We're also seeing young people even deciding maybe I want to be the one that starts the organization or I want to be the one that runs for office because they're not seeing the people who are currently in power actually exercising the power to make the change that we need the most. So they're taking up the helm themselves and starting to run for office and starting to found the organizations and building the movement in a way more tangible way.
Well, when I raised the MTV example earlier, there's a lot of nodding around the table. And clearly, I think it needed a more directness and a more personable action for young people to witness, to want to go out and make those changes. And it's so interesting to see that that's happening today. And Alberto, because earlier, I think you mentioned that the economy, of course, is a big reason why we are seeing a lot of people come out to engage in whatever form they can. So how did we see this play out in recent elections in terms of cost of living? What are you hearing from young adult voters?
Yeah, in 2024, especially, the cost of living and inflation was far and away young people's top priority when they were thinking about their vote. According to our polling and our research, it was actually an even higher priority for young people who didn't vote. So both for voters and for those who didn't show up, that was really the main thing on their mind. And I think it's playing out in a couple of ways. One is just that it's the issue that they want their candidates and politicians to address the most. But we've also been looking a lot at economic issues and really young people's financial struggles. And as Rudy was saying, in this economy, what impact is that having on young people's ability and desire to vote, to engage civically? 40% of young people, and by young I mean 18 to 29, 40% told us that they sometimes or often had trouble making ends meet and meeting their basic financial needs in 2024. Among young people who didn't vote, that was 60%. So it's not just voting. Young people, if they're struggling financially, they're less likely to protest or to go register voters or to engage in some of these other ways that Rudy was talking about. It's a real barrier. So, what does that look like now for future elections, even for today? I think it's connected to why we've seen, a candidate like Zoran Mamdani in New York have some apparent success speaking to young people on these issues. The struggle is real for young people, not just for young people, of course, but we're here talking about youth. And I think the financial struggles of young people, what it means for their lives, what it might even be preventing them from doing what that they want to do, is just something that candidates and folks at all levels really are going to have to address head on, because in some ways, even more than other demographic inequities like race, like education, that also have a big impact on youth participation, this financial struggles piece in the last couple of years has really emerged as one of the big, dividing lines. And it's not just economic haves and have-not. It's turning into kind of civic and political, have and have-nots because of these economic issues.
And sort of a multi-layer question for you, Rudy, sort of riding on what Alberto just shared, and something that he said earlier is it's really hard to listen sometimes, right? I think we're all at fault for that in different ways. And one thing that I remember hearing in the mid-2000s during all of the elections from my peers is they don't feel like they were listened to, or people didn't really believe, or adults in their lives didn't really believe that their struggle was real, even though we were going through an economic recession. And so carrying that burden, I think going into adulthood is very difficult, especially you haven't had a chance to unpack that. And just layering that onto a popular sentiment that we sometimes hear from young adults is feeling like they don't really identify from either political party. So I think there are so many layers here. Are you hearing that as well, Rudy?
Absolutely, we are. We're actually doing a little bit more research at the Alliance for Youth Organizing to better understand young people's sentiments, both who have voted and haven't voted. So in the same vein as Circle, we're still trying to understand young people's motivations, and young people by and large do not identify with either political party. They are more focused on the issues and want to see movement and real tangible change in that way over trying to figure out what party is the best place for them to place their vote. They're getting down to the nitty gritty and looking at candidates, looking at issue stances, looking at vote history to understand who is going to actually show up in the space and like make the changes that we need the most. And if it's not them, then maybe it might be me next election. And also we're seeing young people take more collective action around accountability, not just voting, but also getting involved in advocacy and issue campaigns, and taking that fight to their local state capitol or their local town hall to have more direct conversations with their leaders, speaking during public meetings, and actually tracking and seeing what people are doing day to day, which that accountability is such an important element. It's like year-round organizing and year-round engagement in civics is the dream of like what our democracy is supposed to look like. And we're seeing young people actually doing that in real life. When we're thinking about the MTV's Vote or Die campaign, people are dying whether we vote or not. So like we, at this point, need to see some tangible change, and neither party is actually showing up in the ways that our communities need. So young people are identifying as independent or not identifying with political parties at all, and just showing up and being like, I'm voting for this candidate because I think it's like harm reduction, or I think this person's actually going to move the issues forward in the way that I think is productive.
Well, we're going to continue the conversation after a short break on how younger people are engaging with politics and voting and elections. You've been listening to Rudy Garrett, who's the Vice President of Capacity Building at the Alliance for Youth Organizing, Michael Franz, who's the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project and professor of government at Bowdoin College, and Alberto Medina, who's the communication manager at Tufts University. Let us know if you voted today or if you're a Gen Z and would like to share your experience with elections. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Political advertising has come a long way, from lawn signs to those endless commercials on cable TV. But social media, AI, and even podcasting are changing the way candidates reach and influence voters. Let us know if you're voting today or if you've already voted. We would love to hear about your experience. 888-720-9677. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live, or you can also send us an email at wherewelive@ctpublic.org. Still with us are Rudy Garrett from the Alliance for Youth Organizing, Michael Franz from the Bowdoin College and also Wesleyan Media Project, and Alberto Medina, who is with Tufts University. So, Mike, I want to start with you here. We mentioned social media that plays a huge role in terms of how younger folks are engaging with elections. Social media is also changing the game when it comes to political advertising. So can you talk about what advertising on these platforms have looked like? Because a lot of similar techniques are being used, but it's also gotten a bit more complicated.
Yes, it's gotten way more complicated. It used to be the case that you could just buy TV ads if you were running in a sort of big campaign, a House race or a Senate race or a gubernatorial campaign, buy a lot of TV spots, reach a lot of people, and call it a day. Now, in order to reach different constituencies, you have to go where different audiences are. Older people will watch television still, live TV, primetime viewing, and so on. And so there'll still be TV ads on those locations to reach older voters. But if you want to reach younger voters, you have to go online to social media platforms. And so those platforms have evolved to allow for advertising in different ways, depending on the platform. And now we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars in these elections being spent to communicate with young people and other voters very directly through their social media feeds, if you're on Facebook or Instagram, or before you watch videos, if you're on YouTube, or if you're doing Google searches. And there's also ads that appear on streaming applications. If you're watching your favorite show on Hulu or something, but you're not watching it live, you're still going to see ads unless you pay for the premium service. And those ads are purchased through Hulu or through third-party intermediaries, not like you did at the TV stations. And so there's a lot more ad space, a lot more ad sellers. differential audiences depending on where you're advertising. And it's a dizzying platform array that campaigns have to manage in order to reach voters in different places. And so it's transforming, in some sense, how campaigns operate. They're still putting out very sort of, in many cases, traditional looking 30-second ads, but then they're mixing that in with new and interesting creative ways of reaching out to people on social media as well. So it's a multi-platform campaign environment today, very different from even just 10 or 15 years ago, and it will continue to evolve.
Well, there's also a different kind of directness that we're seeing, of course, because these ads are now literally at our fingertips and you can engage with them directly versus you're watching something on TV and it passes and you go onto your program and perhaps another ad shows up. But that kind of engagement is a lot less tangible. And of course, it's not just the politicians now, but also social media influencers. So what do we know about how influencers are influencing political opinion and dialogue?
Oh, influencers are incredibly important. There was a Pew study that came out last year that I think said about 20% of Americans, so that's 1 out of every 5 Americans, says that they get news on a regular basis from a news influencer. And this would be someone who hosts a program on YouTube. They sit in there, could be their basement or could be their home office. They set up a little background. They record themselves talking about politics. About 80%, depending on the platform, are not affiliated with a news organization. So they could literally be your neighbor who posts things and pontificates about news and gains followers. And then they can monetize that to sort of pay their bills, if you will, by having a lot of viewers. And they are growing in importance. And in fact, some campaigns, including the presidential candidates, have been known to pay these influencers to promote their campaign. And so as people are coming to find some of these podcasters and influencers to be incredibly important ways of gaining information, we don't have a lot of information. It's not easily known if some of these are also being paid to promote particular candidates in ways that we might not hope for in terms of when we get news and information. So this is changing as well. The traditional, sometimes what we call legacy media, is suffering underneath the weight of these new media technologies that allow people to participate or to get news and to make news in different ways.
And because you're doing research in this area, what does the research say about how impactful advertising on social media has been to reaching young adult voters? And before we get to the data, how do you research on something that's so fluid and changes basically every second?
Yeah, so that's the really hard part. So I would say the answer to the question of what's the influence is still, we don't really know yet. And so it's a little dissatisfying because we'd like to have some sort of, some main conclusions, but we're still learning a lot and we're still gathering information and still doing various studies. And sometimes you have to do them in ways that are very specific. You might have to set up an experimental design in order to test for a study, for example. So I was just reading a study that came out earlier this year about an experiment that was done that asked a random group of people to sort of follow on Instagram some news outlets, and then a control group that asked them to follow like a cooking programs or something like that, basically non-political. And they found that the people who followed the news programs, or at least had that part of their feed, were a little more informed about politics. So suggesting that social media can be a way that people can learn about politics if that information is sort of part of their social media feed, getting that into their feed. But that's a very stylized research design to look for an effect. And if you're interested in knowing how that works at scale, sort of what does it mean for all of us? Do ads work? Again, we have to say the jury is probably out. We know from a long history of political science that advertising matters, that can influence how people think about and contextualize their vote choices. But how that translates to these new platforms is still ongoing. I suspect the research will be abundant in the next 10 years.
Well, and Rudy, because of your conversations with younger folks, what are they telling you? How are they getting hit by the ads, or where are they seeing advertising, and do they share whether or not they're influenced by them?
I know that young people are annoyed by the ads that they get when they are in their Hulu trying to watch their shows, that's for sure. And I think young people do get their news by and large via social media more so than traditional news outlets. That is like just by and large how young people are engaging with news. It may be seeing something on the internet and then going to a news source to check it, to fact check it. Because I think another element here of all of these advertisements is they're more personalized, but there's a lot more potential for manipulation that we're seeing here. That like sometimes not everything that they're seeing on social media is true, especially if it's coming from an influencer versus like a official source. And also by and large, even if it's an official source nowadays, you still have to put your thinking hat on and making sure that everything that you're experiencing is factual. And so I think that also contributes to young people's um, experience with ads as well, as they're not sure if they're truthful. They're not sure if this political ad is actually speaking to this person's true record or true character. So even though they're receiving them, I don't know if it's necessarily having the impact that just because they're getting a lot of ads, it's going to sway them one way or another. I think young people are critical and are using their minds to hopefully make good decisions. But we're also seeing that, at least from election turnout information, that this is also having an impact on how young people are voting. So some folks are being critical, and some folks are being manipulated in a lot of ways.
Well, and Alberto, I actually want to build on that, on what Rudy just shared is with where you're standing. Are you seeing younger folks putting on that thinking hat? Are they being critical with the information that they're getting? And of course, this is obviously across the board, but talking about the youth vote today, is that something that you're seeing? Are they questioning more about what they're seeing, or are they just kind of letting it go?
I think young people definitely have a desire to and an instinct to question. I think the bigger question is then, do they have the skills to engage in media literacy, to do that work that Rudy was talking about of actually, going to the sources to check if what they saw is true. So, I think both of what Mike and Rudy said is exactly right. Young people are relying on social media tremendously to get political information, though they still do, watch local news and watch TV sometimes, at least some young people. But the interesting thing, according to our research, is that they sort of understand that they rely on it, but they don't necessarily trust it. So when we asked young people kind of about, the big institutions that they trust or don't trust, it was really the kind of local institutions around them, which I think Rudy mentioned. Local organizations, nonprofits, even local government. They trust more than they trust, for example, the national parties, the presidency. But at the bottom of the list in terms of trust was the big social media and tech companies. So there's this really interesting dynamic of like, I need this for information. Maybe I'm even a little bit addicted to it, right? But I sort of instinctively understand that these, what I'm seeing on these platforms is not necessarily to be trusted. So then again, the question becomes, what do you do about that? Do you double check things? Do you go to the sources? How do you confirm whether what you're looking at is true? And some young people are engaging in those, media literacy behaviors, but as with much else about, young people's civic engagement, it has to be taught, right? And that is still an issue that we have in this country in terms of civic education, incorporating media literacy as a major part of how we prepare youth for democracy. So, we see some percentage of young people doing that, checking their sources, et cetera. And actually, we see that the young people who do are more likely to vote and to report some of these positive civic behaviors, I think, because that does help build trust, right? If you engage in that way and understand, what you're looking at or what you're being fed. But still a lot of work to do in making sure that all youth, especially underserved youth of color, youth without a college degree, can do that work and build that trust in the information they're seeing.
And Mike, before we go to break, I want to touch on the role AI plays in this as well, especially when we're talking about media literacy. And AI is still a rather new tool in this sphere, I think, but we are already seeing some politicians use AI in their campaigns and on social media. So when it comes to AI, what have we seen so far, and what do you think we might see in the future?
Well, just to pick up on what Alberto was saying too, in transitioning to that, I do think all of that and the fact that AI is also changing the game in terms of what content campaigns can create means that being a citizen today is really hard. It means doing a lot of hard work, double checking things, sometimes triple checking things. It's taxing and it's hard. And I think that's what it's important. And young people are being educated and brought up into a world that's hard to be a citizen. And that's so it's even more amazing to see their activism and their passion. And so around AI, the concern really is that campaigns or other political actors that we may not even know much about, dark money groups, shadowy groups that are online, could create content that could confuse people about what is actually true, what's actually real. Did the candidate actually say that? The notion of deep fakes and so forth, hugely, hugely important thing to consider in the next number of years. And it's just going to get harder and harder to be able to know what's a real thing and what's been created through an AI.
You've been listening to Michael Franz, who's the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project, Rudy Garrett, vice president of capacity building at Alliance for Youth Organizing, and Alberto Medina from Tufts University. You can join the conversation. Let us know if you voted or you would like to share your experience with us. 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today is Election Day. Listeners can go to ctpublic.org/where we live and find today's show page to learn more about what's happening around where you live and find your polling station. We've been talking about the youth vote and what it takes to get young people involved with local politics. So, Rudy, I want to jump back straight to you because we've been talking about voter turnout a little bit earlier, and oftentimes voter turnout is the highest during federal elections. But are we starting to see more young adults turn out for the local races and engage in what's happening in their own communities?
Yes, we definitely are seeing that, especially because a lot of the focus of the civic groups on the ground is remaining local and understanding and teaching how to make changes to the environment that's directly around folks. So, for example, how do you get the pothole filled in front of your house? How do you make sure that you get the trash cans that you need? What level of government is ensuring that there are safe parks or that there are grocery stores in your neighborhood? That is a huge focus of a lot of the grassroots organizations that have popped up over the last decade, and of the 20 organizations that are a part of our Alliance for Youth Organizing network across the country. They focus on of course, we do a lot of voter education around all levels of elections, but place a huge focus on local and state infrastructures because that's where a lot of the change actually happens. And so that's where a lot of the civic engagement efforts are. Those are folks first step into politics is hey, I know that you vote for president, but did you know that this level of government actually impacts this issue in a way that's way more tangible for you and will actually give you higher returns around accountability work because you'll be able to pass laws that actually make changes that you're looking for. So we're seeing young folks turn out in local elections by and large incrementally more over time.
When you have those conversations with younger people, are they surprised at how impactful the local vote or local politicians or just local organizations can have on their daily lives?
I would say yes. And I think it speaks to a sentiment that Alberto mentioned earlier in an earlier segment was that we don't do a good job of educating young people around the systems and structures that impact their everyday life. We don't do a good job of making sure they understand what civic infrastructures look like. There's typically around 7 people that represent you from local all the way up to federal, and folks only know the federal folks. When we say you're senator, they think they're U.S. senator. It's oh no, you have a state senator and you have a state House of Representative. You have all of these people that are accountable to you and have different powers over different elements of your life. And so the more you educate young people, the more that they're surprised around, oh, I didn't know that I had a commissioner or I had an alder person, and I didn't know that I could call their office when I'm having an issue. Like, even if you're having an issue around immigration, you can still call these people. If you are experiencing like a resource not available in your neighborhood, your older person may actually have resources that they could spend on that directly. And so the young people, by and large, are surprised at the level of power that they can wield by engaging their local officials. And it's also a really awesome way to empower young people because it makes them feel even more effective. It makes it feel like they're doing something more tangible because voting for president feels like you're a part of a larger movement, and that's beautiful. But especially because young people are really fueled by issues, seeing the impact that you can have on an issue on a local level is a way that like creates a lifelong civic actor.
Well, and as you watch the young people go from sort of learning about the engagement and then actually engaging in advocacy and anything involved in that, and do you see them becoming inspired or wanting to start to run for local office?
Some people, yes. Some folks wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But for some folks, they're like, you know what? I'm not seeing folks show up in the ways that I want to. So I think I'm going to try and see what I can do. And especially if they have the right encouragement, the right resources, and the right opportunities, you'll see young people being willing to take that jump. And the things that we're seeing that are positively contributing to that are being involved in a local community organization, having either like it could be a civic organization, it could be a resourced organization, but having some infrastructure there to provide a political home for young people to come learn and build community, by and large, has the largest impact on young people being able to feel confident to run for office. It also provides them access to the networks that they need. And gets them involved in hyper local activities like voter registration and doing more community education on local elections, and like connects them to the mentors that they're going to need. So it's a beautiful way that like we're seeing pathways being built for young people to actually take action and join public service, and understanding that running for office is an option. It's a tool that they could wield in their tool belt. We're seeing more young people take that dive and actually try to run hyper-local campaigns. You're seeing it happen on the hyper-local level, like running for local school council and being able to represent their community at their local education institution. You're seeing them run for alderperson, especially like in Chicago, we're seeing young people who are 18 years old being like, I'm running for alderperson because I have not seen an alderperson do what they need to do. And it's like really beautiful to see young people take the helm and run for office locally, and hopefully build up a really strong career of representing the neighborhoods and communities that they're from in a way that is authentic and responsive to actual community need, because I think that's the future of democracy. That's the future that we need to see building, is actual everyday people running for office and making the change that they want to see. And so I'm seeing it happen more and more every day, and it's really beautiful.
When in talking about democracy, Alberto, I know all three of you mentioned in various ways that there's a lack of civic education for a lot of young people and a lot of barriers that stop them from going to the polls on election day. Do you think part of the disconnect also includes skepticism about democracy?
Absolutely. You know, this is some really important research that we did this year as well. A lot of young people are looking around and as Rudy said, you know, simply not believing that democracy right now is working for them, which, by the way, is different than the talking point you hear sometimes of like, oh, young people don't care about democracy or they don't believe in democracy. That's not really true. You know, when we asked young people, do you care about free and fair elections? Do you care about the protection of individual rights? Do you care about, you know, pluralism in the political system? You know, far and away, large super majorities of young people say yes to those things. So they care about the democratic values, democratic ideals and principles. But then they look around at politics, and especially for the youngest, you know, voting age Americans, the politics they've grown up with, and they ask themselves, but is this really solving the country's problems? Is this really working for me and my generation? And only 16% of young people in a survey that we did, said yes, we think this democracy as it exists right now in the United States is working for me, is working for young people in this country. So there's a huge disconnect between what young people believe in, what they want to see out of our political system, and what they're actually seeing. In some cases, it's causing young people to lean into that, right? To engage, to do some of what Rudy was talking about and say, like, okay, then I guess I'll get involved and try to fix it, whether it is by starting an organization or by running for office themselves or just by, organizing and voting. But certainly for some other youth, that disillusionment, that kind of disenfranchisement is causing them to turn away or can cause them to turn away if we don't do a really good job of reaching out to them, of having those conversations, of putting those systems and structures in place to make sure that we don't completely lose them, right? That disappointment, which I think I at least would say is warranted with the democratic system right now, turns into pulling away from democracy and from civic participation altogether.
And Mike, I might hand out this last question to you, kind of following what Alberto was just sharing. Do you also hear a sentiment of being discouraged by the political process and what we're currently seeing in politics?
Yes, I do. I think there's been some research in recent years that actually investigate. I'll say, let me preface that I think that young people generally have historically and always find ways to care about their communities. I think the difference in recent years has been that I think many people's disillusionment with the political system has wanted or compelled them to move that passion for community outside of politics into non-political community building, right? So maybe you might have people who say, well, I want to volunteer at a soup kitchen, or I'm going to try to start a food drive in my community. And they have a real passion for believing that these are ways to sort of help others, which they are. And I think that as a result, some young people have moved their efforts outside of politics into those areas. But we're also seeing the political draw people back in, because ultimately the way in which lasting change happens is through the political process. If you want to sort of mitigate poverty or solve the housing crisis or fix education, it's going to happen through the efforts of elected officials passing new policies or raising new funds for new schools. And so young people are eventually, and we're seeing some of this, drawn back into the political system because that lasting change happens in that area. And so there's always a passion for helping other people, but I think the disillusionment for a brief period of time has compelled people outside of the political system. And it's not possible to make lasting change without getting involved in politics.
And actually, 30 seconds here, Rudy, I'm curious to hear, just based on what we just heard, are you seeing more voter education for younger people from where you sit?
Absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of political homes, grassroots organizations taking the helm of ensuring that young people are getting the education that they need, providing voter guides, providing know your rights information to make sure that young people feel comfortable and confident when they show up to the polling place, because not only are the barriers an issue, but also the confidence of feeling like you're making the right choice when you're showing up and you have the information that you need to make the best educated decision for yourself is also a barrier. And I see a lot of grassroots organizations like the ones from the Alliance for Youth Organizing and our partners.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that information. We'll be so interested to hear what happens next year if the data will change. You've been listening to Rudy Garrett, who's the Vice President of Capacity Building at the Alliance for Youth Organizing. Thank you so much, Rudy, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
You are also listening to Michael Franz, who's the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project and professor of government at Bowdoin College. Appreciate, Michael, your time as well.
My pleasure. It was great.
And of course, last but not least, Alberto Medina, who's the communications manager at Circle. Thank you so much, Alberto, for spending time with us too.
Really appreciate it.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening, and happy Election Day, everyone.